So the structure, perfect. So the structure of the workshop is going to be fairly unstructured. So to give you guys the opportunity to ask any questions you might have. So what we'll do is I'm going to let each of the professors to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, just to give them a little bit of overview what the work they do, and then their experience, or perhaps the experience of their students currently going into the job market. And then we'll open it up for any questions that you may have. If we still have time, towards the end of the session, I could perhaps share a little bit of my experience when I finished my degree a few years ago. That was when we went through the financial recession, 2008, 2009. So I also went through a similar experience in the sense of the job market being quite unstable and quite peculiar around the time. So I'm going to start with Professor Corrina. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll let Professor Gaddis go next.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. It's nice to see you all. So I'm Karina Mushroom. I'm an assistant professor in the Fielding School of Public Health and Health Policy and Management. As mentioned, I do need to leave a little bit early because I teach at 1 o'clock. So just so I can gather my thoughts and deal with logistics and everything. So I'm going to jump off this call at 12:45. My apologies in advance. So I'm a global health systems, global health services researcher. I did my doctoral work at Harvard in the School of Public Health in the Global Health and Population Department. And I went on the academic job market when I graduated in 2015, got a job at UCLA, came to UCLA, and here we are. I'm like more than happy to talk about my own experiences, and I definitely know those the best. I have, since coming to UCLA, mentored a number of doctoral students here and elsewhere on the academic market as well, including whether to go academic or not, and kind of how to diversify your search and all of that. So happy to talk about that too. I think, as many people, I mean, I recognize a lot of names of people who are on this call, and so I know some of your backgrounds. And I think if you're coming from a public health, social sciences background, you're a very versatile job candidate. Like you could get a job in a school of public health or in a school of public policy, or if you're coming from a social sciences discipline, you could get a job in that social sciences discipline, right? There's sort of lots of paths that you can take. And in some ways that's great. And in other ways, it makes the market really challenging because it's like a pity that our econ colleague isn't here, but I know like econ has an extremely structured market that is very highly organized, and it has these like clear landmarks that you go through. And unfortunately, like public health is just not like that. Public policy is not like that. I mean, there are some kind of guiding things, but like there's no one place where every job is posted. And, it's just a much looser process. So for example, this job at UCLA, I think I applied like during the kind of rush of applications in the early fall. I didn't have an interview here on campus until like March. It was the day of the LA Marathon. So yeah, like March, early mid-March. And then I didn't get my offer until like May. So, I mean, that's just a very late timeline compared to like the econ market, which is super regimented. So, I think that's one thing to just say about, especially if you're thinking about the public health or public policy type markets. And then like my one sort of big overarching piece of advice that I'm happy to talk more about it is, I think especially if you're finishing a PhD and want to go directly into an academic job, I think a common like challenge or flaw or whatever that those applicants often face is spending too much time and energy talking about what they've done and their dissertation, and not enough time and energy talking about where they're headed. And I mean, I think the sad reality is like, I'm sorry, this is going to sound really rude, but like no one cares as much about your dissertation as you do. Like basically hiring committees are looking at your dissertation as like what evidence they have of where you might be going. And the easier you can make their job in connecting those dots and helping them be like, oh, okay, like this is this type of scholar, and this is the sort of path and work that they're going to be doing, the easier it is. So like your dissertation's one data point for them, and the more additional data points you can give them and the sort of nicer you can paint that picture, that's, I think, really what sort of committees are looking for, because they're investing in a colleague for the next 5 to infinite number of years. So, I think really trying to take a forward-looking perspective to framing yourself as a candidate is really important. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Corrina. That was great. So I'll let now Professor Gaddis go on.
Hello. So just a little background on myself. I am Michael Gaddis. I'm a sociologist, assistant professor in the sociology department. I've been on the job market a couple of times, so I have some various ideas about different stages of the market in case anybody wants to talk about that in the future. I started off as a Robert Wood Johnson scholar in health policy research at the University of Michigan. Unfortunately, they shuttered that program and some of the other really nice postdoc programs since then. So unfortunately, that's not something that's available anymore. But then I was an assistant professor at Penn State for a couple of years before coming here. So the reason why I say all of that is because I think it's important to remember that even if you're actually really good at what you're doing and successful in the job market, often it's sort of nowadays a process of getting to somewhere maybe that you really want to be. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of things. So first, I want to talk about the materials part, because I think this is something that people underestimate the value on the market, is that you're going to be competing against people that are all really good. And it's, as Karina put it, you really need to sort of show who you are and who you are as a scholar, rather than simply focusing on what you've already done. And so it's a process that takes a lot of time. And I think a lot of people try to sort of just jam it in at the end. We've started a job market workshop in our in sociology department, and I've co-coordinated that for a couple of years. And we try to give people some guidelines for start working on things, this many weeks or months in advance, so that you have plenty of time to get multiple drafts done and get feedback from both your mentors and other graduate students. About your materials also, I think you should know that you want to talk like a colleague, not like a grad student in these materials. So like Corrina was saying, you want to talk about, you certainly want to talk about the research that you've already done and is already published, if you have research that's been published, but you really should focus on what your goals for, your other papers that you've been working on that maybe aren't part of your dissertation, or things that you've been thinking about and have started some preliminary work on. I mean, and to some degree, you can sort of, fake this a little bit in saying that, like, I have this idea, and sort of, talk about it like it's a big deal, even if you really haven't put pen to paper on it yet, because in some ways it is the promise of who you will become, rather than who you are right now. And so if you've been thinking about, I want to apply for NSF Career Award in my first year, and here's the idea that I have for this, I think it's great to just put that in there and talk about this in advance. And so, yeah, talk like a colleague, not a grad student. So that part of that is discussing future projects, publication, and grant plans. But also, I've seen people make this mistake, and it's just a strange one that I don't know why this persists, but people talk as if they're going to grad school all over again, that, oh, I want to come to UCLA and then I can work with Michael on stuff. And it's like, I mean, yeah, that's great, but that sounds like you're trying to be my grad student or postdoc rather than, a colleague. And so I would be very cautious about that, unless there's some clear, like, I've started collaborating already with X person at the university and I want to highlight that. One other area I just want to talk real briefly about is that hopefully everybody's starting to recognize this, but apply broadly. Often you don't know what it is that someone's looking for. If you need to work your networks, either your mentors or people you already know at an institution, to get clarification on what this call is actually asking about and what people are looking for, do it. I got an interview for a position that was advertised as not something that was my core area. It was sort of a tangential thing, but it turned out that a dean had put that into the call specifically because they were trying to broaden in that area, and the department just ignored the dean and interviewed who they wanted to anyway. And so if I hadn't applied for that job, I wouldn't have gotten an interview and gotten more experience with the process. And part of that is that the marginal costs for additional applications are usually pretty low, that there's not too many changes that happen from app to app, and people are already writing you letters, and usually it's just a case of changing, you know, the information about where it's going. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. And then one last thing about the apply broadly is just don't rule yourself out in advance. You really just can't afford, especially in this market, to say, I don't want to apply to Wisconsin because I hate the Midwest or the weather or whatever. I mean, if there's really, really specific reasons that you can't do something, then obviously don't. But if there's any chance that you would actually take an offer, especially if that's the only thing you have, apply to that place and just, you know, hope that it works out for the best if you really don't want to go there. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk about those kinds of things more in advance. And I should have started in advance by saying my advice, obviously, because of my own experience, is sort of tailored to what do you do if you're applying to R1s. But I also have some ideas I've tried to help place students at places like Urban and Mathematica, and you know, those kinds of places give you a lot of flexibility, especially in this market, if you want to try to take something short term and still work your way back in the academia.
Thank you, Professor Gaddis. That was very, very useful. So what I wanted to do now is open it up for any questions you guys might have. Anyone, feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions you might have. Anyone?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So
go ahead.
What advice would you both give to a second year or maybe first year PhD student?
Interesting one.
Well, okay, so I'll start. I guess part of what you know, obviously you can't know for sure, but you can. The first couple of years, I feel like a lot of people really start making some inroads into figuring out what is it that you really want, right? I mean, I started off applying to grad school thinking that what I really wanted was to end up teaching at a selective liberal arts college. And by the end of, you know, the first or second year that I was in grad school, I decided that's not really what I wanted to do. And so I think, you know, starting to at least try to question yourself and figure that out at earlier stages is helpful, because, you know, that helps you determine, do I need to be trying to seek out all these collaborations with people that might end up in publications, or do I need to try to start making networking inroads with people at places like Rand or Urban? Or do I need to focus on trying to get more teaching opportunities to really develop that craft and work on my syllabi?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that. I similarly, I mean, obviously I'm in an academic job and I love it, but that's not where I thought I was going. When I started grad school, I thought I was going a totally different route. I wanted to work for like an international organization like UNICEF or something, and clearly it's not where I am. So, you know, I think I agree that taking time to really figure out what excites you and what you love doing every day and how that might add up to a career, I think is really important. You know, I think so. I probably wouldn't say this to a first or second year. I might say this to like a third year. I do think sort of important things to know about the market are something that Michael mentioned, which is just that it's very time consuming. Like the amount of time that you're going to spend preparing that first set of materials. Yeah, it's marginal after that, but like that first time you have to write a cover letter and a teaching philosophy and all of that, like it takes a long time in terms of months and in terms of hours of your day, potentially. So just like really, and realize that that's going to start the summer before you finish. So really just kind of building that into your timeline mentally, I think is important. And then I really also, I think, didn't do a good job with this, and it worked out fine, but I wish I'd known differently. I think that wrapping your head around the sequence of events leading up to applying is really important. So like if you realize that, okay, I'm planning to graduate. I'm going to give myself my own timeline as an example. So like I was going to finish in 2015. That meant I was putting in applications in summer of 2014. So that meant that like by August of 2014, my CV had to have like everything on it that I wanted to be on it to compete for jobs, which meant like if I wanted papers published or presentations at conferences, those had to happen by August of 2014, which really meant like I had to be laying the groundwork for those in like 2013. Like I think once you start realizing how early some of these things need to happen in order to make it onto your CV in time to start applying the summer before you finish, the timeline just starts to get a little more stretched. I think that's a little scary to hear if you're like a first year, but I think if you're like a second year, a third year, and you're pretty sure this is where you're headed, I think being cognizant of that and trying to plan accordingly and not just trying to cram everything in and feeling like you're not putting your best self forward in the end is great. That said, that isn't the way my CV looked and I got a job. And, I think like it can be fine. I don't mean to say like you have to do that, but I think if you can be proactive and do some planning in advance, you may end up a sort of happier person in the end. Especially because you're also trying to finish your dissertation at the same time. Like it's just like a crazy crunch time of, applying for jobs and whatever. So if you can remove some of those earlier pressures, I think it's a little bit easier for you.
Right. So there are a couple of questions on the chat. So, but before I move on to that, just a quick point, as Corina mentioned. Based on my experience in academia, I've been in academia for 10 years or so. Adjusting your path in academia, it's pretty much like trying to steer a boat with a huge, massive boat. So what that means is you are not going to turn around in the next second, or not even within the next hour. So adjusting academia takes several months. So that's what Corina was mentioning. If you want to have something in your CV, you need to backtrack several months in order to start planning. So that thing that you wanted to be in your CV is eventually going to be there. But that takes months in advance. And it's a really good practice that you start doing that now, because if you go into academia, that's in essence what you'll be doing if you want to get tenure. Because the moment you get into the first year into the position, you're already thinking, how many years in advance I'm going to be evaluated and what do I have to show by then? So I start backtracking that timeline. So by the time it gets to my 5th or 6th year in the tenure clock, then I'll have the things that need to be there. So it is just a matter of practice. You'll get there. So a couple of questions. One from, let's see, what was the first one? Let me see if I can go to that. Hila. I think it's already what was already mentioned. She's a second-year PhD and has more than 10 years of teaching experience and wants to go into academia. So the question is, what should she be adding to her resume to increase the chances for getting into academia?
I mean, I can speak for like an R1, and then maybe Michael could speak about liberal arts, because I don't know that market or path at all, really. I think if you're thinking about a research-oriented university, you really need to do research. So I'll tell you the advice one of my advisors gave me, which is that when you're buying a car that has a really great GPS system or some feature, like that's awesome, but that's not the deciding factor necessarily for buying that car. And I think at research universities, that's sort of the way teaching is seen for job candidates. So like if you're applying to an R1 and you have an amazing teaching background, like that's great, but that's not going to be what necessarily gets you an interview. And I think what gets you the interview is interesting research, proving that you can work collaboratively and productively with other people. It's really sort of heavily on the research side. And then if you have teaching, like that may then sort of push you over the top, but I don't think it's sufficient in the R1 context. So I would focus on research experiences where you really have a kind of key role in those. That's just my opinion though.
Yeah, I mean, I think the standards vary a lot across disciplines in terms of the expectations for what is it going to take to get an R1 job out of grad school. I do think that, like, regardless of what those expectations are, you can really sort of spread yourself too thin. And, I see some students that are trying to work with multiple professors on projects and then doing their own thing with a couple of other grad students as well. And often that just seems like it's not really a great path because, you really want to try to make sure that you're getting something published rather than, being able to say, well, I'm working on all these projects, because that's nothing, in the end, that's not really a line on the CV the same way that a paper is. And so, yeah, I mean, my recommendation is like has been discussed, thinking about like, what is your timeline for when you want to finish or when you need to finish? And then trying to think about, what that timeline is for your discipline in terms of getting a paper out the door. Because for us, from the day you submit, if you were to get that paper published in the journal you submit to, so no rejection, right? You're probably looking at a year minimum for that to be an actual acceptance, because of the R&R process that we have. And that obviously that varies by journal and by discipline, but you really need to sort of think about, for you, what does that timeline look like, to get at least a publication out of that. And then this second question about the liberal arts colleges. I mean, I didn't actually go through that process, so I don't know. But I do know from talking to some people and seeing what the job advertisements look like, that often I think you are like put into a position in the actual interview, if you make it to that stage, to teach a class live in front of other people. And that is something that's very different, than anything that we go through at R1s. And so, obviously focusing on having like a really strong statement of your teaching philosophy and pedagogy, and having syllabi ready to show is going to make a bigger difference in that kind of environment than it does in an R1. And honestly, so we had actually in my graduate program, we had a very strong teaching component that we actually had to go through a semester-long course where we read books on pedagogy, and we actually critiqued, other people's syllabi and did things like that. And my suggestion is to actually seek out some books on that in advance, because I do think I am a better teacher from having read some of those books. I can provide them later. I'm not in my campus office, so I don't have them handy, but there's about 3 or 4, I think, that are like really well respected, that seem to come up a lot in terms of really learning how to teach and learning what it is that you're doing in the classroom, rather than just sort of, going off, taking from someone else's syllabus and then sort of winging it a little. There's obviously more to it than that, but I do think that, like, if that's your goal, that probably a liberal arts college, then that should be what you're thinking about from the start, with obviously still doing research, but focusing a little bit more on the teaching aspect of it.
Thank you. Just one quick comment, and then I'll let Rebecca ask a question. I believe she had her hand raised. So one quick comment on what Michael and Corina already said, particularly Michael, in terms of students, graduate students, sometimes getting involved in so many different projects with other faculty members, or perhaps with classmates. I would be very also careful when you spend your time, because sometimes I think what I've seen some students is they try to mimic what their advisors are doing, which is good idea in thinking of how the advisor operates. The problem is that you are going to be evaluated as a junior individual, not as a senior professor. So for a senior professor, it's perfectly fine to be involved in 1,000 different projects if he or she wants to. But a junior guy is extremely bad to try to get involved in so many things, because you're going to be seen as someone that is extremely diverse. They are not focused. So now I'm speaking from someone who has been in committees evaluating applicants, and I have had the experience of hiring junior and senior people in my department, in other departments. So the first thing you look for senior individuals is that they're narrow, they're specific, and you know what the individual is working on. You don't want somebody who has 10 or 20 different papers published, but you cannot put the pieces together. So what I advise sometimes my students, particularly when you are going to go into the job market as a junior assistant professor, is think of UCB almost like a class. Imagine that you're going to take a class, you look at the title of the class, and you look at the readings of the class. Has to be a match. You will not take a class that claims to talk about this topic, and you look at the readings, and the readings all over the place. Because then you will say, why is the class about race and racism? And there is nothing on race and racism here. It's only a couple of papers. That's in essence what we want to see in a CV of a junior individual. A junior faculty would have to have a sentence that says, this is what I work on. And then I go and look into the papers that he or she has published, and there has to be a match. The moment you start writing 20 or probably perhaps more papers, even if they are published, but I cannot make sense from what you said you work on and what the papers are being published, that's not going to be a good idea.
Can I just add one quick thing before Rebecca, just on that? I think if sort of one maybe asterisk is if you're interested in doing primary data collection, like in your career later, I do think, you know, there's some advantage to working on projects where you are doing that sort of primary data collection in graduate school. Sorry, my dog is squeaking her toy in the background. So, you know, I think it's, if you're going to market yourself and say, like, if you're going to show up to a job interview and say that you want to do, you know, cluster randomized trials at the household level of distributing bed nets and assessing, you know, whether that has any impact on like malaria incidents, like grad school is your training period. So you need to be walking into that job ready with the skills to write a grant proposal to do that. So I do think there are sometimes kind of skills-based things, especially around primary data collection, that can be a little bit harder to get if you're going to be trying to do primary stuff later. And I think that does require maybe a little bit more of a waltz during grad school, because sometimes you may have to take on other projects to fill in some of those gaps because you don't really get them in coursework. So that is sort of like one asterisk I'll put on not spreading yourself too thin, is for the kind of skills piece around primary data. Sorry.
That's fine. Perfect. Rebecca?
Hi, so this question is more so for Karina and Hiram, because as a student in a school of public health, you recognize that lots of schools of public health are very interdisciplinary. And so I'm going to be basically competing against people who have PhDs in sociology and economics and all those other things, right? Going into particular public health departments. And so I guess my question for you two who have been on public health committees, what are some tips that I should be thinking about as I'm going onto the market this year to be competitive against people who are from other disciplines trying to get into public health? Because I feel like, you know, we don't really have the option too much of going into like a sociology department, for example, but there certainly will be sociologists who are applying to public health jobs. So like, what are some tips that you would have for me?
Hiram, do you want to go first, and then I'll add thoughts at the end?
Sure. Yeah, I had a perhaps similar experience. In my background actually was not in public health, and I eventually merged into public health. So my advice would be, first, make sure that you know what your strengths are and what your research is about, because you could have, usually what happens that they advertise a position and they say they want people to work on a particular topic, but there are different ways of looking at a particular issue. To the extent that you know what your background and your focus is, that is going to be the strength that you bring into that position, that you highlight that in your application. Like, for instance, when I applied to the position here at UCLA, they wanted somebody who worked on health in Latin America. So I focused my letter and the work that I've done in Latin America, and I put examples of what I'm doing. And I highlighted that my background was in mathematics and statistics. The reason why that makes a difference, because you can have tons of many of the different people working in Latin American health, but they look for many different approaches. If that committee happens to want somebody with a statistical background, then I'll fill that gap. And then I'll be distinct from the other people who are applying to that position. So I think that would be one possibility for you when you apply to these type of positions in public health. Make sure that you identify what is the niche that you are speaking to and the area that you cover. So the committee can identify that you feel that particular need, and that's different from somebody else who would also be applying, as you said, somebody from sociology. So in my experience advising students in sociology here at UCLA, sometimes they look at health outcomes, but the approach that they follow is quite different from what we do in public health. They have a more strong theoretical background. They perhaps don't put a lot of attention to the particular outcome because that's not the main focus, other than thinking about the theoretical constructs. In public health, it's a little bit different. We do have a little bit of theory, but it's more about the pathways, the mechanisms, the biological connections, the links with health, all those type of things that set two people apart, the one that comes from sociology and the one that comes from public health. So that would be, if you're thinking in terms of RO1s, that you pay, the particular emphasis on the research that you're working on. Corrina?
Yeah, I'd be interested if Hiram agrees with this assessment or not, but ironically, given how much emphasis we've put on research so far, I feel like at least the searches that I've seen at our School of Public Health, they're often actually driven by teaching, mentoring, and advising needs. So like, yes, we're looking for scholars to join our department because they bring substantive areas that maybe we're missing, people are retiring, but a big reason why we often want to keep those substantive areas going or introduce new ones is because we have students who are interested in conducting research in that. We want courses offered in that area. So often I feel like the impetus for the focus of a specific job posting will really sort of be driven from the educational side. It's not that like I'm writing an R01 and I need to write in a co-investigator, right? Like that's not the time horizon we're talking about. We're talking about something longer. So I think in public health, we have quite a few departments that are populated or have heavy representation of faculty who are from social science disciplines, not public health disciplines. And in some of those departments, they are often very excited for public health people to join who can teach some of like the core public health classes. I mean, there are certain things that are distinct, as Hiram was saying, about the way that public health conceptualizes things, the models and frameworks that we use, the way that we look at the world. And so I think, you know, speaking to that and really seeing how your training in that discipline contributes to educating the next sort of generation and mentoring new researchers in public health, I think is really key.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, and probably Iran is the best person to answer this. So what's the advice that would you give to an international student? Because, for example, for funding opportunities, as an international students, we have very few opportunities. And when it comes to dissertation grants, it's almost non-existent at all. So, you know, it seems that we have a lot of disadvantage going to the job market, particularly in terms of demonstration of our ability to obtain grant. So what kind of advice would you give to an international student?
I perhaps can take this one. I used to be an international student. There are two types of suggestions that I might have. One is when you go into the academia, that is not so much an issue, particularly for R1s, because universities can sponsor, or most of the time sponsor the HB1 visa, which is for highly qualified individuals. So it doesn't really matter at that point. There would be federal support to hire you as a professor in most universities. The problem is if you want to go into a postdoc, because most of the postdocs are federally funded. If that is the case, it would be quite difficult to get funding from those type of sources. But in public health, sometimes they get funding from NGOs, or they get funding from private organizations. That funding would be available for international students, and then you'll be funded through different mechanisms. So it kind of, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of applying to a postdoc just because you're not legal, what is it called, the green card holder or US citizen. But definitely not for academic positions. I will still apply because, as I said, it's very flexible for academic positions.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Nothing else comes to mind?
Sorry, I have another question then.
Sure.
In terms of the letters of recommendation, which strategy would recommend? Because, like, you know, during the PhD, we work with a lot of professors, some of us particularly, and we may have a professor who knows more of us, but the person was not in our dissertation committee. So, you know, what is the best strategy?
From my perspective, I'm going to speak of from someone who has been in committees reviewing applications. My suggestion would be to ask for a letter for someone who knows you and who is going to write stuff that is not in a CV, things that we as committee are not going to be able to pick up from the materials that you send, because that's exactly the information that we want. If somebody writes about you and says that you're very productive, I can see that in a CV. And if somebody asks and says that you are really good at getting grants, I can see that in a CV. I want to see something that I cannot get from the materials that are there. And what I would suggest, and actually suggest that sometimes to my students, is precisely be wise about the letters. You don't necessarily want to get letters for very well-known people in your area. And the reason is sometimes these people are so busy that they might write a paragraph or so of a letter. That might not be the most useful letter you want, because again, the committee is not going to take out a lot of information from that letter. And that person might be very well known, say in public health in a particular area, but public health is so broad that if I get the letter, I might not even know who that person is. It might be very well known in that particular niche, but not in mine. So getting that letter, again, is not going to be very useful. I don't know if Corrina or Michael have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good advice. I do think there's a slight caveat with that last part, in that, you know, if you're able to sort of plan this in advance, so if there's somebody that really makes sense, that could be on your dissertation committee, who's like an expert in a particular area that your dissertation covers, and you can get them on your committee and actually have a relationship with them, even if they're not at your own university. I think that's one scenario where that could be a little bit different. But again, you have to, it's really sort of hard to gauge, and you might want to actually talk to other mentors and professors about that, because you never know. You know, I've definitely seen where people will agree to be on a committee, but then they really don't do much. You know, they show up and they have advice during the meeting, but I haven't seen them comment on drafts, for instance. And that person's certainly not going to probably be able to write you a very strong letter, because of time constraints, plus just not knowing you that well. But I think there is a scenario where, you know, if you're able to sort of work it out to have someone on your committee who's a well-regarded expert in your specific thing, it could be worth it in that case to have them write a letter. But yeah, I think in general, it's something that people think is a good idea and then often doesn't really work that well.
Mm-hmm. So before I go to Jacob for a question, Corrina, I don't know if you have any last words, because you're almost about to leave.
No, I'll jump off in a second, but go ahead with your question.
Okay, Jacob.
Hi, everyone. So recently I've encountered an opinion that I thought struck me as somewhat unorthodox, especially given while we're in grad school, we're always pushed to publish. And that's that, like, you can also get in a situation where you might be publishing too much. And particularly I've heard, these are all anecdotes, but people that were applying for like assistant professor position, and they had like 4 publications. Obviously it matters where they published as well. And also, I guess, as you go on to postdoc and then assistant professor and so forth, you're expected to have published more and more and more. So that was the first thing, like, if you have any thoughts about that. And then the other thing I'm wondering is if you do take a job at a tenure track position at R1 university outside the US, is it more challenging to come back laterally or even like downward or whatever to university, an R1 university in the US, let's say while you're assistant professor in the first 5 years before you get tenure, and then maybe after?
Any comments on that? Michael or Corrina?
Well, so regarding the publication thing, that's a little bit odd, and maybe it fits in a little bit with what Hiram said earlier, in that you don't want to be spread out over too many different areas, right? I mean, I definitely could see if we had someone applying to an assistant professor job and they already had been an assistant professor, and you know, they had lots of publications, but they're second or third or further down the list author on all the publications, and they're across a bunch of different areas. That would be very weird, and might suggest that they're essentially a glorified research assistant, or at least just a specialist who is brought in on papers to do one thing. Otherwise, it's kind of hard for me to imagine that there's a scenario where you're publishing too much.
Exactly.
Yeah, the only time I've heard concern about this is if someone is like so unbelievably productive that search committees are like, well, what was your role on all of these papers? You know, like this seems suspect. And I have heard that question asked during interviews. And I would expect that antennae might go up a little bit more if you're like on the super high end of productivity, but I feel like it would have to be pretty far out there. And if you had a genuine role in all those papers, like good for you, you know, you should do them and publish them and talk about them and claim your role. I mean, on the second question about transferring between universities, my experience and what I've seen with friends and colleagues in the academic market is that there's a lot of fluidity, and that particularly in the kind of pre-tenure stage is often an opportune time to do it. You're, you know, on pretty solid footing on a few projects, so you could transport them and it wouldn't be totally disruptive to you. And that the door between European and academic market at that stage is actually a little bit easier, I think, than the immediate post-PhD stage where the markets look different, the titles are different. It's like a little bit harder to navigate. And so I have friends who've got, you know, been at European universities and come back to the US and vice versa, actually, at Asian universities, kind of like midway through the assistant professor level. I don't know why, but it doesn't seem to be like that much of a barrier, as long as, you know, if you're planning on going to a European university and coming back to the US, as long as you've kind of met the standard of what your equivalent in the US would have done at that career point in terms of teaching and publication and service and all of those things. So that's my sense of cross-continental movement.
Yeah, exactly. I would second that. Any other questions? Okay, so let me just do another comment on Jacob, now that there are no more questions regarding a lot of publications. Besides what Michael and Corrina already said, it could happen that if you take a long time to get into academic position, people might actually wonder, why is it that if you are very productive and do these things, why is it that you haven't yet gotten into a position, academic position? And that happened actually to me. That's why I'm sort of giving that example. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, I graduated right around 2008, 2009, when the financial crisis hit in the countries. A lot of positions were canceled. A lot of the economic downturn happened 2 or 3 years later. So it was really, really hard to get a position. So I was taking postdocs positions, but at the same time, my wife was going through her education too. So we have to somehow coordinate both things. So what that meant was I kept being productive as I was doing my work. By the time I applied to the positions, I had already published over 20 or so papers, and very good journals. So I actually had people asking me in some of the interviews this very question: why is it that if you have all this career and it's clear that you've done this work, why is it that you haven't, gotten a position? Because now they are wonder, is it something about this guy that he seems to be working well, but nobody seems to want him? What's going on? So that could be a possibility. So that's in the cases in which I had to explain, well, it just happened that I graduated around this time. My wife's also going through this process. So, if I were to take this position, I would probably leave and my wife would stay behind. So all these type of things that I had to explain to make sense of that sort of trajectory. But that usually happens, after the fact. You just explain that in the committee.
I guess I have another quick question.
Sure.
Which what your comments just made me think about. What is kind of the perspective on multiple postdocs? I know it's in some circles it's kind of looked down upon, but in other circles it's like, well, if you want extra training in, 2 different areas, then multiple postdocs is not a problem. But what are your thoughts on that?
I would say, from the top of my head, I would say at that point it's almost like on a particular cases, one-on-one cases, because there are not that many people, I think, that take several postdoc positions. So as long as it looks like there is a trajectory, I would say might not necessarily be that bad. And that it looks like you're moving in a direction that is being complementary. As I was giving you my example, when I finished grad school, I went to a postdoc at USC and I did a little bit of gerontology, and then I went to do public health at Harvard. So I complement that work. So it looked like I was doing aging, and then it looked like I was doing aging and health. And then I continued my work with aging and health in Latin America. So everything that it was a connection. So even though I was moving to different places, the work seemed to be moving in a particular direction. So I was able to make the case that the reason why I was moving and I was getting this opportunity was because I was getting this training, and here is the evidence for what I was doing and where my research was moving. So I would say that if you explain that in the letter and justify why is it that so you're taking this many different postdocs and show with evidence, meaning production, productivity, that is the case, I wouldn't think that would be seen as a bad possibility.
Okay, thank you.
Jacob? You had another question, Jacob?
I didn't, sorry.
Oh, okay. Any other questions? Anybody else? Anything else? Any last words, Michael, before we leave? If there are no more questions.
No, nothing, but I'm happy to talk with other people individually if they want to. If there's something, more specific that you didn't feel like asking in the broader group, because we've, my experience is still limited, but we do this workshop in the Soc department, and so I got maybe a little more experience than the median person in terms of thinking about this stuff. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And my general suggestion, if there are no more questions, is academia in general is a very long-term process. So I think I will go back to what Michael said at the beginning. Make sure that in the first years in grad school, you try to make a decision whether you want to go into research or you want to perhaps do some other area that is not necessarily R01 universities, maybe nothing that is academia. If you made up your mind and you think you want to go into academia, be patient. It takes a very long time to get there. But as long as you continue doing your work, chances are you're going to get there. The problem is that if you wait a couple of years and nothing comes up and you get discouraged, that I think is the worst that can happen. Because academia, as I said at the beginning, is like moving a huge ship. You are not going to move it in a few months. It takes a very long time to move it in the direction that you want. And if you add on top of that what we're going through with the pandemic and all that, it's going to take a few years for the job market to stabilize. So just keep that in mind as you start applying for next year or next couple of years. If things don't look very bright in the job market, they might pick up a few years later. The thing is that you need to keep doing the work that you know is going to get you there. If you want to go into R01 university, then that means keep doing your research, keep being productive, keep being involved in conferences. You're thinking in more liberal colleges, then perhaps you want to improve in teaching, you want to broaden your skills of the courses that you'll be teaching, so you have more to offer in liberal colleges, but always work in the direction that you would like to take. But definitely my advice is be patient and keep working on it. Any other questions? So, well, thank you everyone. I'm gonna drop also my email in case anyone has any further questions. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. Any questions I might be able to help. And anything else, any other questions, any other, let's see, any other workshops that you think would be useful also for you as students, also let me know. We're trying to plan more workshops, one more for next quarter and perhaps more for next academic year. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. So we'll see you at CCPR. Have a great day.